The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery is as recovery does. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or maybe you simply want to know just a little bit more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you, as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured actor John Larroquette, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, musician Bonnie Raitt, authors Brene Brown, Anne Lamott, J.A. Jance. There's also a featured interview that actually I did 41 years ago with former First Lady Betty Ford. This was even before the Betty Ford Center started. All these interviews and more are on our website, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story, their insight, their path. In this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, an interview with legendary singer-songwriter Judy Collins, who won a Grammy for the song Both Sides Now. She also was nominated for an Academy Award back in 1975. She talks about her life, including losing a son to suicide when she was 13 years sober and he was 7 years sober at the time. This is a story of remarkable resilience in long-term recovery. Here is a quick clip from the interview.
You know, when I got sober in 78, there wasn't anybody on Oprah or any place else talking about alcoholism except one person that I heard, and that was Dick Van Dyke, and I'll always be eternally grateful to him. Nobody was talking about that. There was no discussion of treatment centers. I was in the dark about what was the matter with me, and the fact that I have an illness that is something that requires abstinence.
My conversation with Judy Collins is coming right up. Later in the podcast, we'll hear from a friend of Judy Collins, a guy who was also in long-term recovery, the great Dick Van Dyke. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, so thankful and filled with gratitude that you chose to listen to our podcast. There are a lot of podcasts on recovery. I'm blessed and honored that you have chosen ours. Our website, by the way, recoverycoasttocoast, one word, .org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities. They offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast, and we ask that you please share it with at least one other friend. Recovery is an American way of life. And if you would like to help us out financially or know of a foundation that may be interested in underwriting our program so that we can continue to carry the message, to send the message to people in need, we would be so grateful. Our email address, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. Talk about long-term recovery. Wow, Sundown has been paving the road for long-term recovery since March 4th, 1968. They just celebrated their 56th anniversary. They are one of the oldest, most successful programs in the country. Their formula for success is pretty simple. They're a nonprofit organization. Their bottom line is long-term recovery for their patients, not profits for investors. They also own their own land, 30 acres, a beautiful, beautiful place at the mouth of the Yakima River Canyon in central Washington, not too far from Seattle. Plus, they have an outstanding national reputation in the addiction treatment community, and their staff is second to none. They've been together for a long time, which is very important in quality and consistency. In addition, they take most major insurance plans, and they have trained staff that deal with all of that, which can be a nightmare for individuals. Let them handle the heavy work. Plus, they don't just treat and release. They follow the patient after completing inpatient treatment, providing them with the tools necessary for long-term recovery. If you're considering treatment for yourself, family member, or friend, do your research, but definitely consider Sundown M Ranch. Take a look-see at their facility at sundown.org/gallery. Sundown M Ranch is where recovery begins. I'm sitting here having myself a nice big cup of coffee. Let's hear from iconic singer, songwriter Judy Collins. She lives in New York City with her husband Louis, and Judy has been sober since April 20th, 1978. She's coming up on 46 years in the sunlight of sobriety, one day at a time. Here's my conversation with the amazing Judy Collins.
Joining us from her home in New York City is legendary singer-songwriter Judy Collins. Back in the mid-'70s, Judy Collins was riding a great wave of popularity, but behind the voice and inside the heart, she was coming unwound due to her drinking. She went into treatment, and she came out into recovery, which continues to be a daily gift. Her career is still going strong, as is her recovery from alcoholism. Judy, welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast.
Thank you so much. I'm privileged to be here.
Judy, we've asked listeners from around the country to submit some email questions for you, but before we do that, I want to take you back to the spring of 1978 when you were introduced to a friend of mine who is truly one of the leaders and legends in this field, Dr. Stan Gitlow, and the role that he played in helping you find your path to recovery.
Well, Stanley Gitlow really, Stanley saved my life. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And I had been going to therapists and doctors and people in the professional, quotes, unquotes, arena for years, trying to find out why I was so crazy and why I drank so much. And I just simply got no help. I was told so many times, well, how can you be an alcoholic? You're so successful. And we all know the answer to that is that anybody can be an alcoholic, and the outside doesn't necessarily tell much about the inside, at least for those of us who can cover up these illnesses. So I had been looking around and trying to figure it out. I had started to wake up a little bit to the fact that there might be some help, but I wasn't really ready to do anything. And I called a friend of mine in New York who I'd known from a dance class, and she was married to a very famous New York drunk who used to get into fights in bars, and he would show up on the cover of the New York Post or the Daily News, was having bloodied somebody's nose in a fight in a bar, and all of a sudden that wasn't happening to him. And I sort of missed the drama. I kind of depended on that to, say, well, I'm not so bad. I don't fight in bars. So I called his wife and said, what's going on? She said, well, he's sober. He's not drinking anymore. And I said, do you think you would talk to me about that? And she said, of course. So I called him up, my friend Patrick, and called him up, and he called me back, and he said to me, and this was later in the day, so I was in not very good shape to hear anything, but I took copious notes. He said, you have to go and see Stanley Gitlow. There's nobody who understands this illness like he does. And I went, and I saw Stanley, and Stanley put me into treatment, into Chit Chat out down in Pennsylvania. And I got sober, and I will always feel grateful to him. I'll always feel grateful to Chit Chat, which is what the name of the place was, and always be grateful that I was able to find my way out of the dark.
Chit Chat, an excellent treatment program. Now it's called the Karen Treatment Center, but it's been around for years and years, and they really do great work. Email question from Martha in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. What was treatment like being a celebrity, and were you treated differently from the other patients?
The answer is absolutely not. One of the funny things was that in those days, I don't know what they do now in treatment centers. I'm told that people aren't allowed to have jobs, quotes unquote. It's some sort of violation of patients' rights. But by golly, we had to work down there, and many people were on the food service, and they would be in the dining room and in the kitchen. And Carmela, who is the head of the workforce there at Chit Chat, said, you're not going to sit in that dining room and have people staring at you. She said, you're going to drive the garbage truck, which is what I did. I drove the garbage truck. Had she known how much I enjoyed driving the garbage truck, I'm not sure she would have agreed for me to do it.
Oh, that's funny.
It was an ego thing with me. In fact, I sent home to New York to get my driving gloves, my leather driving gloves. But Ralph and I, he hauled the garbage cans and I drove the truck. And we regaled each other with our drinking stories. We had a grand old time. She would have separated us if she'd known what fun we were having.
You know, back to Stan Gitlow for a second. The first time you called him, as the story goes, you didn't show up for your appointment, and then he almost did not see you.
Oh, yes. The nurse, Elizabeth, was very firm on that point. She said, and I had passed out, of course. I was completely forgot. I used to do that on a regular basis, at least 4 or 5 times a week. I called her back and said, I'd like to make an appointment again. I'm so sorry. And she said, well, sorry, you missed the boat, and we have sailed without you, and we don't make appointments with people who miss them. And I whined and begged and pleaded and carried on, and she finally agreed to let me come in again. Thank goodness.
Question from Gilbert in Athens, Georgia. What happened when you got out of treatment? What did you change in your life?
Everything has to change, and I don't think there's any question in my mind that top to bottom, my life is different. So much of the drama is gone. So much of the disorder is gone. The serenity and the peace of mind are great gifts. And of course, they are the result of a lot of work and a lot of self-exploration and examination. Also, hanging out with people who are also staying sober is a great solution. I don't know how I would have done this in any way, shape, or form if I hadn't had gotten to know a community in my hometown and other places that I visit of people who don't drink, who don't use pills and don't use mood-changing chemicals except under the distinct order of a physician in cases of surgery, etc., which, by the way, is okay. I hear people saying that they can go through any kind of pain and agony without using painkillers. When you're using something when it's called for, like having a shoulder replacement, which I've had to do in sobriety, the pain regulates how your body treats the substance which is helping the pain. When you stop using it for the pain, it will then reach into your addiction. But if you're guided, and Stanley was wonderful about that, he's really helped me with that, with the short-term use of painkillers, and that, of course, there are times when we have to use them. Beware of fentanyl. I would just say that to anybody, not just an alcoholic or an addict, but fentanyl is dangerously addictive to all of us and has to be carefully administered. But doing the things that I've been told and following the example of other people has been a huge change. And I didn't do that very much when I was drinking. I had my own plan, and I was on my own beam, and nobody's going to tell me what to do. So there's a little bit of some of that left, I suppose, in all of us, but I had a lot of help, and the differences are enormous. The chaos is at a very, very low roar, if it's there at all. And I sleep at night. What a gift.
An email from Sandy in Abilene, Texas. You have been very open about your recovery, which I believe opens the doors for others who are still hurting to consider doing something about their drinking. How difficult is it for you to be that open, and does it in some way help you as well?
I am not about to keep my mouth shut about alcoholism. I kept the secret of alcoholism in my family with a father who was dying of alcoholism and destroying his own life and threatening the lives of his children and his family and his friends for way too long not to talk about this. This is an illness. This is not a moral issue. It's something that we finally have come out of the dark about this. Since when I got sober in 1978, there wasn't anybody on Oprah or any place else talking about alcoholism except one person that I heard, and that was Dick Van Dyke. And I'll always be eternally grateful to him that I was watching in a blackout, half of a blackout one afternoon. I was watching Merv Griffin interview him, and he was holding up a full bottle of something clear that we drank all kinds of quarts of, and saying, I used to drink one of these every day. And I thought, whoa, this is outrageous. I better turn this off. Somebody might see this. So nobody was talking about that. There was no discussion of treatment centers. I was in the dark about what was the matter with me, and the fact that I have an illness that is something that requires abstinence and a lot of deep internal work. I didn't know that. So I'm the first to say, to spread the word. It doesn't hurt anybody. It takes off takes off the covers, and then people can say to themselves, that's interesting. Well, could be I could look at my drinking too.
Absolutely. In fact, you mentioned Dick Van Dyke. Back in 1976, I co-hosted with Dick Van Dyke an 18-hour telethon about alcoholism.
Oh my God!
Which was way back in the dark ages. I mean, you were right. Nobody was talking about it then.
No, it was 2 years before I got sober.
And we had 18 hours of television time, much like telethon, to talk about alcoholism. The amazing thing about that it was both positive and negative. It was very successful in terms of people going into treatment. It was not successful in terms of raising funds, because every time we said, call this number to pledge your support, everybody was calling and saying, what can I do about my son? What can I do about my daughter? What can I do about my husband? And so fortunately, we had people from AA who were manning the pledge lines, and they were able to do some 12-step work. But it was pretty amazing. And Dick Van Dyke really was a major force back in the 70s. A question from Sierra down in Naples, Florida. And Judy, are there certain songs that you sing that are about recovery or that embrace the gratitude that is recovery?
No, all my songs are about gratitude, and they're either good songs or not. If they're not, I try not to sing them. I don't believe in that particular... there's joy in music, and music is healing. Music is healing no matter whether you've got Parkinson's or alcoholism or just a plain old regular person with aches and pains and life to deal with. Music is the healing gift that we're given to get us through life and all kinds of problems. So I might write a song about some cowboy down in Texas who's trying to find his way out of a bar to get himself clean and sober. But if I did, that would be what the song was about, and you would know it. But all music is a journey towards light from darkness, I think. That's my opinion.
Jackson in Montpelier, Vermont writes, I read somewhere that Joni Mitchell influenced your getting sober while you were in treatment. Is that true?
Well, it is in a way. She doesn't know it, or somebody might tell her. I had one record with me. For some reason, I had a record player because...
In treatment? Wow.
I would have had some access. Maybe my brother brought something for me. In 1978, I don't know what we would have had. I guess we would have had albums. I know I had this big album with a picture on Don Juan's Restless Daughter. Was the name of the album. And I listened to it over and over and over and over again. Haven't heard it since, by the way. I've gone on to other of her records and other people's, but it was really a big help for me. I think having music with somebody whose voice was very, very approachable and whom I just adored was very helpful to me.
Michael in West Hollywood writes, I am a singer-songwriter and have struggled with a drinking problem for years. Sometimes I think my best songs are fueled by alcohol. I'm afraid that if I go into treatment and sober up, the muse will be gone and I will lose whatever creativity I still have.
Well, you're lucky to have anything that you think of as creativity left. I don't think that drugs and alcohol fuel creativity in any authentic way, but there have been an awful lot of people who've been geniuses and brilliant writers and composers and creators who have had our illness. And I can't say anything except that the last 4 years of my drinking, I couldn't write, I couldn't remember, I think I must have written 2 songs in all those years. There's 4 years. I was strung out. And I think given time enough with the illness, that would happen to most people, unless they're very, very lucky. But then there's the kind of life that we're leading. I would trade anything to have what I have. You know, I would give back every kind of success in the outer way that I could ever dream of if it meant that I was going to not have what I have now, which is priceless. So, no, I don't know. I don't know that it's a conscious effort that gets us into treatment, although in my case I was intervened, really by Gittler I was intervened on. I never would have done this on my own, believe me. So whatever it is, whatever the intersection of catastrophe that happens to you, just thank God for it, because without it, you might not be here.
Beverly from Tampa, Florida writes, your son committed suicide after you stopped drinking. How long had you been sober, and how did you get through that unimaginable time? How did it affect your recovery?
Well, it's a terrible story, and it always reminds me that we are dealing with an illness in which relapse is possible. We know that we can relapse from other illnesses, and alcoholism is no exception. I was 13 years sober. My son had gone into treatment in 1984, so he was almost 7 years sober when he committed suicide. I was 13 years. I would have been 78, 88, 89, 90, 91. So he was 7 years sober, but then he went out and drank again. And as he put it in his death note, it was a cheap drunk, unsatisfying, and it took way too long to die. But he had instances before he got sober. He had problems with this suicide ideology, which, my old friend Ed Schneidman says a lot of people, many, many, many people can live with depression all their lives. All of them do not take their lives. So depression is not the only element in this illness of suicide. Maybe it's an illness, maybe it's a mental condition, maybe it's a quirk of the mind, whatever it is. My job after his death was not to kill myself a day at a time, and the only way I could do that was not to drink and to keep talking about it and to do a lot of writing about it. I wrote a book called Sanity and Grace, which came out of that early writing that had kept me from taking my own life after his death. It's a terrible thing to go through. And as a suicide survivor, I also know that people who survive suicides are far more apt to take their own lives. So it's something that needs to have attention, and people who have had a loss to suicide have to go to any lengths to get the kind of help that they need. And there is plenty of help. So for all of these things, there is. If you reach out, if you go to a hotline, if you go to the internet, you're going to find the help that you need.
We've got some email questions for Judy, one from Sober Steve down in Lexington, Kentucky. What role does spirituality play in your recovery?
Well, it isn't a role, and it isn't a part of our lives. I think it is the whole enchilada, as they say. Our lives are about our relationship with God or not. And if it's not, then the journey's probably harder. And if it is, then the journey is going to find us and find ways in which we can get closer to whatever it is out there that runs this show. That's sort of the way I look at it. Music helps me a lot in that respect. It takes me out of my own petty problems and concerns, and art does that for me a lot. And people will look for their spiritual center in lots of different ways, whether it's fishing on a river, whether it's going to a museum, whether it's spending time meditating or getting a guru, or going to India, or doing candles and incense. It's all personal, but I don't think there's any place on earth that it isn't part of our existence, whether we like it or not, whether we claim that we aren't involved or not, whether we say we're agnostics, atheists or not. We're always dealing with that central question, denying it, expressing it, empathizing it, enlarging it. So seems to be true. That's sort of the big issue in our lives.
Terry, Madison, Wisconsin, you are around alcohol all the time, and probably from time to time drugs too. How do you handle that? Is there ever an urge to pick up?
I don't handle it. I don't handle it. I don't think of it, and I don't keep it in my home. After my son's death, until then, my husband was he would have a glass of wine from time to time, and so I would keep things here, but I don't anymore. After Clark's death, it's like perhaps you needed to have some sort of a sign from God. It's not about thinking it through always. It's about an illness which may, in fact, intersect with your life and just take your life over again. And so I don't keep alcohol at home. And I don't like being with people who drink. There's no point in it. There's no fun in it anymore for me. It's quite boring, actually. And if they could hear themselves, they would probably be bored stiff, too. So I stay away from a lot of the action around that thing. I don't like parties much. I don't go to where there's a lot of that going on. I had a sober wedding, not one drop, served to 500 of my nearest and dearest, and nobody seemed to complain.
Judith Rose, Charlotte, North Carolina, you were a major activist for the peace movement in the 60s. Do you think the recovery movement needs an activist? Alcoholism and addiction kills more people each year than foreign wars.
Well, I couldn't agree more about that. And I do feel the National Council does a wonderful job of educating, and I believe in education. I believe in those of us who feel comfortable with it. Obviously, if it's not something that you feel comfortable about, you shouldn't. But as far as I'm concerned, talking about this illness with your nearest and dearest, and even people who are total strangers, is something that actually helps the planet. And if you can help the planet, I think it's as important to do that as to try to turn the lights out and keep the planet green.
Final question from Mary Ann, Columbus, Ohio. How has recovery enhanced your career and your personal life, and what is life like today?
Well, first of all, I would be dead if I was still drinking, and I would have not been drinking very long. I would either be dead or I would be so incoherent of it that you wouldn't know that I was on the planet. So there's that. And then everything about my life has changed in the inward sense. My work habits are different. I find just tremendous interest in everything that I'm doing, and I find that creativity is, as I said, I hadn't done anything creative for a number of years, and I just don't stop. I go 24/7. I work like mad. I have a huge concert career. I write books. I make records. I travel. I sing. I talk. I have the energy probably of a 25-year-old. And when I was 25, I was crawling to work.
Singer-songwriter Judy Collins joining us on Recovery Coast to Coast. Judy, I thank you so very much for your time, and I wish you continued success in your career, and, of course, one day at a time in long-term recovery.
Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed my interview with the amazing Judy Collins. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path you've chosen, and as long as you have been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, actor Dick Van Dyke. He's got some reflections on long-term recovery.
She has always been your baby, but when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, thoughts on recovery from the great Dick Van Dyke.
The true motives of our actions, like the real pipes of an organ, are usually concealed, but the gilded and hollow pretext is pompously placed in the front for show. Charles Caleb Colton. Some of us have made many unsuccessful attempts to give up drinking, drugs, overeating, gambling. We tried hard to quit, but always ended up going back to our addictions. Our primary reason is that our motives for stopping were misdirected. We quit drinking because the doctor or judge told us we'd better quit. We stopped using drugs because we were afraid our boss or co-workers suspected something. We abstained from overeating to make ourselves more attractive to our spouse. We tried to quit gambling because we were on the verge of losing our family. All the while, we harbored secret reservations about staying stopped. We weren't yet completely willing to do whatever was necessary to stay clean and sober and abstinent. Our real motive was to get off the hook or back in someone's good graces. All that has changed. We've learned from our own experience, as well as the experience of others, that we can't successfully give up our addictions by trying to do so for somebody else. Today, there's no question in our minds that if we expect to have successful recoveries, freedom from dependency has to be our #1 priority for ourselves. Thought for today? You forsake lasting recovery if you try to quit for someone else's sake.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with at least one other person. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch, again, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button, absolutely free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone who's experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. They have Spanish-speaking individuals there as well. 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. It's a new website designed for individuals, families, and friends. Features information on how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and free treatment options. Find healthcare support there as well. How to help someone else or find help for yourself. It's all in one place, findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout-out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown Am Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.